Thanks for coming to this seminar. As you know, the topic of this seminar is about rejection more broadly, but also particularly failed funding bids, project proposals, job applications, and the kind of lessons that we can learn from these rejections. And I also just want to clarify that what we're trying to do today is to have a very broad understanding of rejection in digital humanities. So that not only includes academic topics and academic contexts, but also what you might call alternative academic contexts, such as professional services, and also areas where people interface between academic and professional services contexts, which is very germane to a lot of people's experiences in digital humanities. So as Michael said, I'm a senior lecturer here at SAS, and I also work in the Institute of English Studies. And I'm really pleased to welcome our speakers for this conversation. I will just go in the order in which they're listed, not in alphabetical order, random order, shall we say. Naomi Wells is senior lecturer in Italian and Spanish with digital humanities at the DH Research Hub at the recently renamed Institute of Languages, Cultures, and Societies at SAS, School of Advanced Study. She's also the co-director of the school's doctoral center. Her current research focuses on the internet and social media, particularly that in relation to online multilingualism. And her wider interests include cross-language digital research in her role as joint editor of the Digital Modern Languages section of the Modern Languages Open Journal. We also have Lauren Tuckley, who is the director of the Center for Research and Fellowships at Georgetown University. As director, she's charged with overseeing the development and administration of transformative co-curricular undergraduate research programs and mentoring students and young alumni applying for nationally competitive fellowships. She's currently a PhD candidate in writing and rhetoric at George Mason University, also in Washington, D.C., where her research focuses on genre theory, occluded academic genres, and the rhetorical pedagogy of the personal statement. Elena Spadini is also with us. She's currently a research navigator at the University of Basel, Switzerland, supporting digital humanities and particular scholarly editing projects across faculties. She's been working in digital philology as a Marie Curie Fellow at the Huygens Institute, at the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences, and as a postdoc at the University of Lausanne. Her background is in Romance philology, and her research interests span from medieval manuscripts to born digital literary sources. And last but not least, our colleague at SAS at the University of London, Andrew Fairweather-Tall, is head of research and research partnerships at the University of London, where he leads the university's research support function. Before this role, he was recently head of humanities research support at the University of Oxford, where he was responsible for strategic planning in the humanities division, including research facilitation and funding. He also earned his DPhil at Oxford in Imperial and Commonwealth History. So I'm really happy to have you all here. I'd like to start by asking or posing to you a general question, which is, what is the impact of rejected applications on people early in their career in particular? So all of you have worked with early career students or academics in some way. So how can we talk more about rejected applications, how those are impacted, or how those impact people differently than those who are more established in their careers, who of course tend to get more positive outcomes. Bearing those general questions in mind, I thought we would turn to Elena first and get your thoughts.
Yes, thanks, thanks, Christopher, and thanks to the organizers. So while thinking about this seminar, I was reading something completely different, which is this book by Daniel Ferrer, is like models for genetic criticism. So he's one of these theorists of genetic criticism, studying authorial manuscripts. And one of the things that he says is how scholars, writers have to judge their own text at a certain point, and the rewriting process implies a judgment. So there is a point in which the writer, the author says, this is an error, this is something bad, this is a failed sentence, and I want to change something. And what the scholar has is these hesitations, these changes, this recognizing the failure of by the author, and study these failures, and defines the writing process of an author through these failures. So I was thinking of this, and this was really speaking to me in the sense of how failure can be a defining agent, a defining factor for us. So Ferrer talks about describe the genesis in terms of a shift of, and now I'm quoting, just a very short quote, a shift of internal emphasis and a re-evaluation that introduces new sortings, new eliminations, but also new interpretations of the existing material at every moment. And this is like, at least seems similar to what we do every day when we try to define our own life and career. So in this sense, failure can be a defining agent and similar to a literary genesis, because it's never without, because our own definition of a career path is never without errors. It's like programming, in the sense that programming is debugging, so it's also facing these failures. When I think of my own career path, there are failures that I don't like to talk about, like, I don't know, some rejected applications or for grants or stuff like this. But there is one failure that I always mention, because to me it was in the end a positive, something that I recognize as positive now, which is how I also entered the world of digital humanities, because in the beginning I was going to do something different, and then there was a failure, and then I was looking for alternatives, and now I'm very happy of where I am, and even happier than I think if I would have gone in that path, I'm not sure how happy I would have been. So this failure sometimes can be a defining gadget, both in a positive and also sometimes in a negative way, of course. And I think when we think about early stage, on one side, it is true that failure in early stage of career, on one side, it is true that at an early stage, you might have more alternatives, but it's also harder to deal with it because you have less experience. And it can also be like eliminating from the beginning the possibility of something. So yeah, complex.
First of all, I have to say, just as someone who also works in textual editing like you do and enjoys genetic criticism, I really love the reference to Ferrer. It's perfect. And it's also life imitating art in a way, isn't it? I really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Yeah, I like a lot this book.
Yeah, anything by him is interesting. So I'd like to go to Lauren now. So you work a lot with undergraduates, advising students who don't have a lot of experience with failure. So how do you communicate the value of very difficult prospects for certain kinds of applications?
Yeah, thanks so much. So much of like what I've come to think about, or consider, like, what's going on here with failure. What does failure mean? How does that get internalized? How do those internalizations then impact subsequent behavior? I've worked a lot with that, particularly in the context of students applying for what we in the US call, nationally competitive awards. So oftentimes, like, my office at Georgetown University will identify students that are really, like, and I say this with air quotes, like the highest achieving, right? Because I want to be clear about some of the baggage that comes with those terms. But really, we're looking for students that are most, exemplifying academic success. And then we nominate them for scholarships like the Rhodes is probably one you've heard of. The Fulbright's another one that kind of has a global recognition. And since these students are coming from backgrounds where they've had a lot of prior success, there's this like heightened state of what happens when or if I fail, especially if one hasn't really potentially engaged with the practice of failure. And so I think the long story short here, some of this is probably going to come down to, like, you'll get better at rejection the more that you're rejected, right? Because you'll see that there are other possibilities on the other side of that. But if you're at a place where like you haven't had a lot of experience with that to date, then I think one of the things that's important, so I'll give you, first of all, I'll give you an assessment, and then I'll give you 3 points. I think this has to come down, we all handle failure differently, right? So figuring out how you yourself, how you have this like attachment theory, right? They're like, your parents, the way that you were raised, predict how you're going to have interactions in the future, right? Well, your own personal like internalization of past failure experiences is probably a predictor of how you're going to like interact with the opportunity to fail in the future. So in some ways, what does that mean for you to fail? How in the past have you handled failures? What about that failure process can you learn is your own sort of personal, way that you situate an experience of failure? And then from that, standing outside of the failure itself, of how you habitually have either reacted towards even the anticipation of failure, you might gain some insights into things that you want to correct for or reframe or overcome. And those could be different depending upon your own past experiences. So first, how have you thought about failure in the past, or how has that operated for you? So just my personal experience, having been someone that, those early initial failures prevented me from, in subsequent opportunities, to potentially going for high risk, high failure opportunities. And we know that if you don't apply for things, if you don't apply yourself, you won't potentially maximize the return of having put yourself out there, quote unquote, right? So like thinking about how that has operated in your past is really important, because it helps you then. What I would say are the 3 things that I work with my students. Number one, we're just going to talk about it. Like, some of it is the anticipation of failure, what happens, like we don't want to talk about it, so then we compartmentalize it, but then that compartmentalization of failure anticipation ends up like impacting our behaviors in subtle ways that we hadn't realized in the first place. So I think like really thinking, what are the stakes here, right? So talk about it. What are the stakes? What happens if I'm, don't achieve the goal? What happens if I'm not successful? What happens if I fail? Thinking about the stakes, and then anticipatory reframing. So thinking about, if these are the stakes and then I fail, then what will be, ahead of time, before being in the failure kind of mode, where then you just sort of, oh, like there's something wrong with me. I don't know how to do this. I shouldn't have applied in the first place. So that kind of circumvents that trap on the other side when the failure is immediate. So what are the stakes? How do I reframe ahead of time? If I'm going to fail, then what might that look like? And how can I think about that, already anticipating it as a what next, as opposed to I shouldn't have, right? And then thirdly, I think it's helpful to own the experience of failure. I think having this panel or participating in, opportunities to share personal failure experiences lets you claim control over the narrative of how failure is potentially impacting your life. That gives you control. So being more open about past failure experiences, you know, letting other people into that both helps the atmosphere from which I think we in a hyper competitive way don't want to reveal our failures, but allows you to have control over it. So assess yourself where you're at, talk about it, name the stakes, reframe ahead of time, and then just own it, I guess would be like my TLDR. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lauren. That was really interesting and important to think about. This, I think, transitions nicely to what I think, Naomi, you could elaborate on, which is a kind of similar dynamic that happens with early career humanities researchers, you know, who are also used to being high achievers and you know, successful enough to have gotten into a career in the humanities, and yet struggle to confront the long odds for all kinds of opportunities. So Naomi, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I can talk kind of from my own experience as well of being an ECR until recently. It's always strange when you lose that label, but also in my role in the doctoral centre, which requires a lot of thinking about, you know, what are we preparing our current humanities PhD students for, and is the sector a place in which, you know, we want to prepare them in the best way and make sure that is a place in which they can succeed. And I do think I'll do a quick caveat because we are, sorry, yeah, I'll try not to use too many acronyms. We are obviously, I think the situation is better in the digital humanities, but the other main discipline I work in is languages. And you may know that languages has suffered decline for various reasons, and it's been an incredibly challenging job market for kind of ECRs in the field of languages. And I think it is similar in other humanities disciplines. And so I think it's important that we balance that it is important to talk about failure. It's important to talk about what we can learn from failure and what that value of that learning experience is, and that we're not always going to succeed. Nobody's going to not fail at some point. But I think we do need to balance that with recognizing that I would say current early career researchers in the humanities, at least in the UK context, are facing what I would say is a level of failure and rejection that I don't think previous generations did experience. And I think we do need to be sensitive to that, particularly at this kind of time in the sector. And I think that's where we really need to recognize that failure can take a repeated failure, and it goes back to what Lauren was saying, you know, repeated failure and rejection really can take a mental toll. And, you know, we do need to develop ways of dealing with that, but we also need to think about what the effect of that mental toll is, and that, you know, as Christopher raised at the start, failure further on in your career when, yes, it's disappointing, but you still got a job, and failure to get a fellowship or a job that means you can't pay your rent is a very different kind of situation to be in. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge that. And also, you know, I am now in the position where I'm on job interview panels with ECRs. And I think what I find hard is that, and I'm sure a lot of people have been in this situation, that you see so many applicants who would excel in the role, and you know that, you know, you have one post and you know there were a number of those people who would absolutely excel in that role. And I worry about the wasted potential of people who are applying for lots of jobs and they are excellent, and, you know, their time isn't spent doing the job or doing the work that they could be doing. It is spent in what is a very difficult career job sector. So I think it's important not to put failure always on the individuals, and to think about how systems may also be failing them, and to kind of, maybe we'll come back to that later, what we can do to address the failures of those systems that might be actually failing the individuals rather than vice versa.
Thank you. That's a really excellent point about systems. We've also received an interesting note in the chat that we can address later regarding this. But I'd like to just ask Andrew to jump in, particularly from your experience with regards to failed applications. So can you just talk a little bit about the process of learning from failures like that and taking them forward into new applications?
Thank you. Yes, maybe I'll start off though by doing what I think is a fairly standard academic thing, and trying to reframe the title of this seminar, because I mean, I do think it's really important for people to think that submitting, whether it's a job application or a funding application, and not succeeding is still not a failure. The fact that you've actually got that far and been able to put coherently on a page a set of things that you want to do, if it's a funding application, or why you want a particular job, that's not a failure. You may not get the job, or you may not win the funding, but at least give yourself credit for getting that far. So I think I want to reframe the word failure here and say that there's far less of it than people might acknowledge. But going on to answering your question about failed applications, I mean, the first thing I always tell people is you've got to take a bit of time for yourself to grieve, because everybody who puts in an application, whether it's for a job or whether it is for funding, puts a huge amount of effort and a huge amount of their self into that. I know it's no longer fashionable to talk about Kubler-Ross and the grief cycle, but there is a certain amount of, one has to recognize that you have to go through some of those stages of, before you get to the acceptance that you have to move on. So I always tell people that, giving yourself a little bit of time to rail against the peer reviewers and think how unjust life is and so on and so forth, that's an important part of moving on from this. I think the other things I'd like to make about points about applications is that once you've gone through that process, there's all sorts of things you can take out of that for the future. It doesn't have to be another application doing and trying to apply for the same thing, but a lot of people who apply for postdoctoral fellowship positions, what do you get from that application? Well, you've already got the basis for future job applications, because one of the, sure as eggs is eggs, one of the interview questions is going to be, well, what are you going to do about your research? And if you can already have a kind of a pre-packaged, here's a plan I made earlier, you're halfway there, aren't you? So I think that there are important things for early career researchers to reflect on when, if they're rejected for fellowships, for funded fellowships, about how they can reuse the work they've planned. And I think I'd say to people, particularly early on in their career, is the skills you learn in making an application are applicable to many roles in life, and I speak from lived experience of that, because you could characterize my academic career as a failure because it ended with one very minor publication about 20 years ago. Do I consider myself a failure as a professional in a university? No, I don't. So I think, that that process, one has to own it, as Lauren was saying, and I think you can adopt many of the things that you learn from writing an application and carry them through in other different kinds of job scenarios. I'll make one final point, I think, about moving forward, and that's around, I do think it's important for people to analyse what may have gone wrong with their application. And one of the great things about so many funding application systems is that you get feedback. And you get your peer review comments. And I think, once you've got over that initial, they don't understand me and they don't understand my project moment, which everyone goes through, I do think actually reflecting on where are the truths that you can read in those, and taking those and thinking about how how you can revive and renew what you're doing and learn from that. So again, going back to that, submitting an application, not a failure, you get so much out of it. I think it would be my key point. I have many other things I could say, but I think I'll stop there for now, but I might kind of interject as we continue the discussion.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I heard a lot of similarities between what you were saying and what Lauren said about owning the experience. And part of owning it is to go through the grieving process and to find out what you can do to salvage the good bits of it and fix the parts that didn't work so well. So I think I've made, go ahead.
I think what Lauren was describing about all those alphas who've never experienced failure, the same is true at every career stage. You know, I've worked with some very senior people who've gone through their entire career. They've won postdoctoral fellowships, they've won grants and so on, and then they have to deal at some point in their career with a failure. So it's just as hard at every career stage. But I would make the point that Naomi made, that actually there are certain points in your career where it's even harder, because it may give you a fork in the road in where you go next.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. So if we think about expanding beyond, say, the early stages of one's education or career to consider the more systemic elements of rejection that Naomi wisely alluded to, and Andrew, you just mentioned it again. I think that's quite relevant, these systemic elements. So there are a number of systemic barriers in the academic setting, which I think is just as true in the UK as it is in the US and Canada and elsewhere. And a lot of this is expressed indeed in job and grant and fellowship applications and in the peer review process. I've had personal experience with this in the digital humanities, where we have pretty specific challenges relating to interdisciplinary work, where traditional peer reviewers don't see why you should be applying technology, or maybe the technology is too sophisticated to be understood, and so on. But regardless of that particular context, everyone in the academy encounters institutional structural barriers that influence whether they're moving ahead on their various applications. So Naomi, I'm wondering if you can jump in and talk a bit about the challenges that face interdisciplinary scholars in recruitment, in review, and in other situations that you've been in.
Yeah, I think that's interesting here, because I think there's a bit of a gap between some of the discourse that celebrates interdisciplinarity in funders and institutions, and then a kind of maybe a failure to address the traditionalism and conservatism that remains in some recruitment panels, that remains in the peer review, people who peer review. And I think, again, a personal experience of even when I worked in languages, the fact that I sat across 2 language areas, people were like, oh, that's great, you've got so many options. And then all the jobs were written for, you need to be a specialist in this language, and no jobs were written that said, you know, someone who can sit across languages and things like that. I think I'm fortunate at the School of Advanced Study, that being quite unusual, and also I would say, I think this is a strength of digital humanities in the humanities area, that it is more accepting of kind of unusual combinations of disciplines, less traditional kind of less conventional career route. I think in particular, if you ask anyone in DH what their route into DH was, you will find there isn't a pathway. People have come in from very different pathways, and I think that's a real positive of DH, that there isn't that idea that you do this and then you do that. There is this openness. And I think actually I can see that one of the comments in the chat as well is we do need to think about who is failing and why, and we also need to pay attention to the kind of equity and inclusion, because if we are very narrow in how we define an academic career or what we think a research project looks like, it does also have implications for who is being included in academia and who isn't being included. And I think that's really important, that we look at that kind of, what is that conservatism and traditionalism of the structures, how is that impacting on people? And also, well, I've certainly been in job interviews where I've gone, actually, I don't know if I want to fit into that structure. I'm not sure I want to go back into that single area. So, you know, I think, again, that is a learning experience from failure. Failure can be, actually, that wasn't the right job for me, because they did want someone who had a very traditional profile. But I think addressing more openly those kind of problems with the structures and systems is really important.
Yeah, I wonder, Naomi, if you could just, sorry. I wonder, Naomi, too, it just strikes me that there's an interesting shift that happens when you go from early career status to being someone who recently promoted, congratulations, but also sitting on on interview panels and peer reviewing for funding agencies. How do you deal with these kinds of systemic issues once you've now made that kind of transition over to evaluating? And how do you manage, say, another person that doesn't see things the way you do because of the institutional conservatism?
Yeah, I think that's really important that, when you are in a position to be able to, and I think it's worth saying, for example, the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council last year explicitly put out a call saying we want early career researchers on the peer review college. We want people who have, maybe cross-sectoral experience or interdisciplinary experience. And I think it's really valuable to take I did, apply to the college because I think it's very important that we critique things, but if we do have the opportunity to be involved in decision making and start to make sure that, I'm sure my reviewing is not perfect either, but I think it is important to try to change the systems through the structures you're able to, whether that's reviewing other people's grants or research, and making sure that there are, it can be really hard to find interdisciplinary reviewers as well. When I edit digital model languages research, it's really hard to find someone who does have that digital and languages expertise as well. So if you do have that breadth, or if you do want to change things in the systems, if you have opportunities to be on the other side and to start to push back against that traditionalism and conservatism in those areas, I think it's really important to take up those opportunities and to understand it from the other side.
Great, thank you. That's really interesting. Elena, I wonder how might having more data about job applications, which might be similar to the information we have about grants, like with numbers of applications, expected percentage of success, and so on. How could this kind of information help people better use their time and resources when applying for different kinds of opportunities?
Yeah, thanks. Yes, so I was thinking about this aspect because there are moments in life in which one spends or might spend a lot of time and effort in applying for jobs, and as Andrew said, that's really a lot of time, and you have to project yourself all the time in different situations, and then this can be very hard. So I think it's not always easy to find a balance between trying to have all the opportunities and do not spend all the time in applying for jobs. And so I was wondering, when, for example, you apply for a grant, you know generally which is the rate of success. So you have a at least vague idea of how probable it is that you will get this money. And when in the case of job application, is at least in my experience has never been like that. I understand that, of course, is a very different situation. So proposals for projects are often the same year after year, so you can just present, institutions and funding bodies can just present the data from previous years. And in job applications, it's not exactly the same, but sometimes there are similar job applications that have been opened in the past, and it might be also interesting for institutions to keep track, to collect data about this process, this employing process, and at least after the first selection has been done, it could be possible to share information about how many people are there. For instance, sometimes it happened to me to have answers like, we have many applicants, so the process will take longer. What does it mean, many? 20, 80, 200? And it's not that it changes completely, but I think it might help a bit. And I honestly don't know. I haven't spent too much time thinking about it, but I think it would be also interesting for institutions to keep track of that. And then more in general on this issue, sorry, I have ambulances that go out of the hospital just from the corner. More in general on these issues, on the systemic issues, I totally agree on what Naomi just said about the importance of having early career researchers and people with cross-disciplinary profiles on the institutional panels. And yeah, I'm also seeing some changes in the as you said, Naomi, in the UK, but also elsewhere, that this is at least slowly being recognized as something valuable. So that's a positive sign.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea, particularly because, and Naomi, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I've also been on interview panels too, and I'm sometimes shocked by how random it sometimes seems to be. That sometimes you'd think there's a post where you'll get 500 applications and only 5 people apply. And sometimes you put something out where there are way more applications than you would expect. And sometimes it's just a numbers game. And it's good to know what those numbers are and why they are the way they are. But we don't tend to get that kind of information. I want to pivot to Andrew. Not only because we've actually had this conversation already, but it's good to replay conversations like this. And that is, what do you do as a researcher when you are passionate about a project and it doesn't get funded, but you still think that it needs to be done? And what are the kind of considerations that you need to think about when doing the kind of research anyway that you want to do, even after it's been rejected?
Thank you. Can I just make a point also about what Elena was saying, that I mean, I probably shouldn't do this to a group of digital humanists, but data is only one element of the kind of decision taking you should make when you are thinking about going for applying or not. You need context as well, and I do think that what I always say to people is that, I can give you the success rate for a scheme, but actually you need to talk to your colleagues. You need to kind of see who's already won these awards, and how do you measure yourself against them? How much do you want this? The chance is 1 in 10, but if you really want it, then you should always go for it. I think so I think data is only one part of the conversation. But I do agree that it's quite an important one, and every institution should have it at their hands. Certainly, if you're in the UK and you ask one of my colleagues what the success rate is for a particular scheme, they should be able to give it to you, and not just the national success rate. They should be able to give you their local one as well, which can be quite important, because I think one of the other considerations around any of these calls is sometimes it pays to apply from certain universities. I may go back to one of Naomi's points about peer review and so on. But anyway, going on to answer my question, which you posed, Christopher. I suppose I would turn the question back in one sense, which is that if you've put all the effort into applying for money, this must surely be work that you want to do. And if it isn't, why were you trying to apply in the first place? I think actually there are times when you look at somebody who's saying, I want to apply for X, and you're going, really, do you? Or is it just because it's one of your KPIs, or you've been told by your head of department you must put an application in? And I do think that a more reflection earlier on about your motivation is really important in all of these processes, because I don't want to support somebody who isn't actually really interested. They're doing it just for the numbers or just because they feel they ought to. I want somebody who actually is passionate about the project and really wants to succeed, because that makes a better application. So what else can you do afterwards? I do think that there is very often, there are opportunities to look to other funders for the project that you want. Maybe you improve it slightly because you've had some peer review comments. I take the comment in the chat that sometimes you don't get those comments, but if you do, I also talk to people about chunking things up. Maybe you can take a smaller application elsewhere. Maybe you can look for internal funds. Certainly in the UK, most institutions have at least some funding available, seed funding, that they are interested in giving out. And many universities these days are also very mindful of both the pressures on early career researchers, but also their duties towards equality and inclusion, and they will reflect that in how they support or how they put money into seed projects. So I think my sort of short answer to all of this is that if you really want to do it, the research will find a way, and do seek the support that your institution can give to help you do that. Collectively, we should be able to. A good research project will succeed somewhere. Yeah, that's my belief. And I think generally that's supported by the evidence that even if you don't get funding for it, you will still undertake that research in some form or another.
Yes, that's a very constructive way of thinking of it, indeed. So I want to ask Lauren now. So if rejection, failure, and so on is likely to remain an essential experience for many of us, how can we become more comfortable in owning it, as you said, but also moving forwards instead of recoiling?
Yeah, thanks. And really to build on some of the great contributions that have just been offered, particularly around the like situating the experience of the failure, ensuring that you've elevated your awareness of like how actually the institutionalization of the process itself is opaque. So like there's so much that goes on behind the scenes through you have those final interviews for the same opportunity just another year later, and they're all very different, the experience. Sometimes the competition is really high. This is holding constant for numbers. Sometimes the internal competition is really high and sometimes it's just not. And so much of that is just dependent on a lot of things that an individual applicant can't control for. So like, I do think it's super helpful, in addition to thinking about diversification and, like the resistance to more traditional modes of doing things because we've always done them that way, being a motivating factor to serve on, some sort of peer review panel, or being a part of what goes into decision-making processes just to help, like, add diversification to who gets to do what. I think it's super helpful for individuals to see how much, for a lack of a better way to put it, luck goes into it. So I do think that like understanding how, when you don't know what's going on behind the scenes, one of the defaults that we do is internalize there's something must be wrong with me. And then that just doesn't necessarily help either prepare one for future opportunities of failure, or to pivot. And again, going back to another great comment about the learning that happens after. And we throw that around like, oh, I'll learn from it and, I'll apply again somewhere else. And I think that's great. But there's a two-part move here. One, it's, yeah, let's like contextualize this and not necessarily have that kind of internal self-blame, I'm not worthy, et cetera. That's not helpful, nor is it reflective of sometimes the things that are not about one's control or what one could have done anyway. So like making sure that that's an element that one has a situated awareness of depending upon what you're applying for. But two, that learning process is, okay, yeah, I'm learning the habit of failing. Like, oh, I'm failing a lot. But if you fail and you fail and you fail, like you get to a point where you're like, well, am I really learning anything other than that I just am not like good enough or something's not happening? So that learning piece, again, goes back to the idea that like, have you maximized your ability to be aware of what's happening behind the scenes, number one. And number two, I think that every opportunity to apply for something, even if it's exactly the same as what you applied for last year, or if it's a similarly enough opportunity that, you know, like I put this application in here, got rejected, I'm gonna like, you know, rehab it and throw it in this other competition, right? For whatever you want to do, fellowship, job, whatever, right? Like, be sure that you're aware of how that context, even if it's the same thing, changes. And therefore be careful about, and this is like this is the soapbox I'm always on, because I'll get, oh, it didn't work out, but I'm going to take that really great application that I put together and then just like slap it together and put it in the next competition. So stop for a second and really think about the strategic way that you want to adapt what you've already thought, learned, put together in a new context, by one, trying to heighten your awareness of the hidden things that go on behind the scenes to the ability that you can. And sometimes that's even just like finding people who won before, asking lots of really thoughtful questions, like asking for feedback. Most of the time people are like, no, you're not going to get feedback on your application or your interview performance. Just kind of like in my experience, that's what happens. People are busy, but sometimes you do. And it's like going forward and trying to figure out what was happening behind the scenes to the best of the ability, to the best of your ability. Then in the next competition, making sure that what you do is, as much as you can, responds to the new application environment that even that same work might be existing in. So like, I think it's about, again, to summarize, it's yes, like experiencing failure, you'll get better at it. But if you find yourself in a place where you keep failing repeatedly at the same task, then there's something in the process that has to be changed. And that can be diagnosed, and the learning can happen by learning more about the hidden institutional features that stand behind the competition process. And then also really making sure that whatever you do is always, as much as possible, responding to the context of the thing that you're applying for, which just because it's the same title or the same opportunity or whatever does not mean that the context is the same.
Thank you very much. That was really good advice. I wonder if we could talk more about something that you just mentioned, and I'll open this up to everybody. I alluded to it with Naomi a bit by considering what it's like to be on the other side of the table or behind the scenes, as you said. But to all of you, whether you're an advisor or a peer reviewer or an administrator, how has this perspective on rejection informed your own work?
Shall I go first then, as the non-academic here? I think what it's made me much more humane, I think, with many and patient with those that are trying hard and are failing. And I think that understanding that the reasons behind the scenes why that's happening does help you. It does help you explain to others and coach them through the process. How it affects my own work, I think I write a mean application now, and that's because I've read so many that both succeeded and failed. And I think that it goes back to Naomi's point about being involved at peer review, as a peer reviewer, and on interview panels and so on and so forth. It's not just about what you can change for others, it's also about what you learn through those processes that you can then apply to your own situation. So I'm deadly when it comes to writing applications now, because I've seen so many of them coming through. I know what works. So I think that's how it's changed my perspective.
Very good. Elena, you also wanted to say something.
Yes, actually, I can just kind of repeat what has been said already. This idea of the, I mean, in my experience as a peer reviewer, like for publication conferences, funding bodies, so I don't have experience on being on interview panels, but more on the peer reviewer side, is like the more I got this experience, the more I see how luck is a factor there. There are these factors that that individuals cannot control, as Lauren said, and that helps in kind of relativizing, if that's a word, a bit the failure. So to have this situated awareness also that Doreen was talking about, and I think that can be very helpful. And as Andrea said, also as Naomi said, this is a bit this experience of having many excellent candidates in just one place. So you know that this happens, and then when the same situation happens to you, then you know that this may happen and it's not just your fault. And so basically you have a lot to learn for yourself when you are on the other side. Also in the terms that Andrew was in the experience that Andrew was talking about, like when you have experience reading a lot of applications, that's a bit what I'm doing. I'm doing more at the moment. You start to see what can work and what not, and that can help you if you want to write one, definitely. Mm-hmm. So yeah, don't have much to add, just to reinforce these good points.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Any other thoughts from Naomi or Lauren?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's good to be on both sides, because you can, when you go to become a peer review, it can be helpful thinking of your own peer reviews to think, what don't I want to become as well? You know, I think always being on guard, because all of us have biases and believe what a good academic looks like or a good research project looks like, and saying, well, actually, am I being open? Just because I would have done it this way, make sure I'm not clouding my judgment because this isn't what I like doing. You know, I often think methods, there's a lot of, when you pick your methodology, for example, there are a lot of methodology is also about it is about what's the best academic. Sometimes it's also a kind of personal or what you've been trained in. And I think always reflecting on, you know, what biases and what privileges you bring to that role, and thinking about what kind of reviewer or interviewer from my past experience do I not want to be, or do I not, you know, we all are in danger of becoming more traditional or, you know, conservative. And I think being on guard for that in our own practices is important.
Yeah, I really like that point. And I would just say what Andrew said about being more humane is something that we should really take away as well, because I've noticed, being on the other side of the table, that because I'm keenly, you know, aware of my own past failures, I want to be as constructive as possible, even if I'm not giving the most, you know, positive outcome to somebody. So, you know, reframing someone's application in terms of how can we best make this constructive for them, even if it's not going to work out, is, to me personally, quite important. But it seems like we're all kind of saying that too. Sorry, Lauren, did you want to say one more thing, or did I miss a hand?
No, you're good. You're very thoughtful to ensure everyone's included. I appreciate that. So, man, there's so many last little things, but I only want to take up maybe one more thought here. And I think that, like, if I've learned anything, it's basically the more that you know and are connected to the network of activity, the more at some point something's going to give. So, like, whether that's trying to figure out, you know, why something wasn't successful, or how that decision got made, or reapplying but taking another tactic, it just keeps coming back, but with a different tactic. And the more that you keep hitting your network like that, as long as, you know, you are kind for, you know, and respectful of people's time, etc., and you're doing that with just you know, you love the work, you're trying to figure this out. If you do it with gratitude, I found so many people, you know, just like Chris was saying, is they're really receptive and want to help. So I think using the failure as a moment to, like, move towards as opposed to away, and understanding the value of that network and making those connections and respecting your network, the more that the network will come, you know, the more that it will produce you. I guess you could say it like that. So I think that, again, like, I imagine if you ask all the panelists here, what was something that, where did it click when you applied for something? And often it's like, oh, you know, I had this person that, and it was someone that gave me the feedback. It was someone that put in a good word. It was someone that, like, showed me something that I was a fit for that I didn't think I was in the first place, but knew me. So much of that is about those relationships. So I think relationship management is probably something that's related to failure that we don't often like think about as much, that I think it would be helpful to like be a point that you leave with today.
That's a really excellent point. Thank you. I don't think that came up yet too, the importance of relationships and networking, and particularly with DH, I've found that that's a pretty important tactic that works really well, because DH is so collaborative. It creates these interesting networks that you don't always find with the lone scholar types. Right, so it is 6 o'clock on the dot, which means we will transition now to the Q&A, right on time. So we have some comments in the chat, it looks like. So perhaps we should tackle one of those first. And we can also open up to any comments, questions you have, if you would just want to unmute yourself at some point. But the first one, there's a comment about getting better at rejection the more you're rejected, from a TED Talk. So there's a nice link to that. But I do, and thank you for that. I do want to raise the issue that was made about neurodivergent people who might not deal with rejection in the same way that some of us might not. In other words, you know, as this person comments, a neurodivergent person might underperform in interviews, which means more rejection than not, even though they might have stellar records. So just wonder if any of you have any thoughts about that.
I don't really have experience, but I was recently talking with a colleague about the different university systems in Italy, where I've studied most of my university time. Exams are all, at least in the humanities, they are all oral exams. And that put a lot of people under a lot of pressure. And I have friends, for example, that provided medical certificates to try to have a different exam because it was really not, because they do not feel at ease in that situation. And so I don't know, but it's not about providing medical certificates, the solution, but about, yeah, maybe thinking of alternatives in also the procedure and the way we conduct interviews. I don't know, just something that came to my mind.
What I'd say in answer, other than to my sympathy for the questioner about rejection, is that no panel goes out to, every panel wants to recruit the best person. Okay, so I do think that if you're honest with a panel and clear and explain what's going on, they should be doing their best to get the best out of your interview, and they should be able to make adjustments to allow that to happen. That's my experience of working on panels, that they will go the extra mile if they're aware of what's of the challenges, because they you know, genuinely, you don't want to recruit the second best candidate just because you know, they happen to speak better on the day. They want to get the best out of everybody that they interview. Yeah, so yeah, that was the point I was going to make.
Excellent. Naomi, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I don't know if Danae wanted to come in, but yeah, I just want to say, I think also it's about a holistic interview. And I do think we do need to address job interviews. I mean, they have stayed the same for a long time, and they do some people are very good at job interviews, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're very good at the job. And I think that's an important distinction to make. And I think if we can have a holistic, I mean, academics, I know we're having an off-the-cuff conversation now, but a lot of academic researchers are better when they prepare. You know, they might be better with prepared talk. So, you know, make sure you do have a presentation and it's not just a conversation, because maybe they'd be better with something they prepared rather than off-the-cuff questions. And so I guess trying to have a more holistic recruitment process where you allow different strengths to come through. But yeah, it is an important question, I think.
Yeah. So Danae, do you want to jump in and respond?
Yeah, so yeah, I do agree with that about the holistic approach. If I can share personal experience, I applied for a job with a big tech company, and I managed to get to the, let's say, the 4th round. And that's when I experienced the box ticking method of doing an interview. Because a lot of the time, there are people who have like a lot of experience doing their job, but not a lot of experience conducting interviews. So they're giving this list of things that they're expecting their candidates to kind of just ticking boxes. So if you underperform, if you're neurodivergent, if you have ADHD or dyslexia or something like that, and you underperform in this interview, you will fail ticking those boxes, even though you might have the skills to do the actual job. So even though they say that they're very inclusive and they're really sensitive about mental health and neurodiversity and all that, they don't really prove that during their interview process, or by how the interview process is structured, let's say. And it's somehow similar in academia as well, in some cases. For example, if you don't have many publications, I know from personal experience that no matter what I've done in my professional career as a researcher, there are cases that the first thing that they will go and look is how many publications I have. And that's the first criterion of if I'm gonna get the job or not. And there are so many aspects of why someone might not have as many publications, like might be like personal health issues or all these other issues that someone might have that they're not taken into consideration. And maybe for a neurodiverse person, it's a bit harder to write papers than it is for someone else, let's say, or they never had the right support or the correct support to do that. So that's kind of all these are things that I'm I'm thinking, because I'm looking for a job at the moment, and I had some rejections, and yeah, it's hard not to feel like a failure, especially when you don't get feedback.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. And it's really important that you've brought these things up, because it does speak to some of the systemic issues that we've already raised. And I do think that we could do more to avoid the kind of structural box ticking kind of exercises that favor a particular way of thinking. So thank you for that. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Any hands in the air? I can't see all the boxes. Looks like. Okay. Well, I did wonder, I saw a comment from Victoria Landau. The more young scholars in your subject have previously gotten funding through a particular scheme, the better coaching and support you'll have when you try, which increases your chances. I thought that was an interesting comment, but I wonder if you're still with us, Victoria, if there's a question attached to that, because it seems like there might be, and it seems like an interesting question to pursue. Aren't Zoom seminars fun? Maybe she's getting a cup of tea. Any other questions, comments? Do you want to jump in again, Danae?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Well, no one else is asking,
yeah,
so go ahead.
So how do you deal with this feeling of failure when you don't get feedback even after interviews or many rounds of interviews? Because I've been refused feedback because it's either the company's policy or you get this automatic email that says, due to the high volume of applications, we won't be able to give you feedback, even though you even you might have an interview and waited for 2 or 3 weeks.
Any thoughts from the panelists?
I think that's a really important issue. And I think particularly when you get through to interview, you should be getting feedback. And I think this is also an issue with I've had it with funding recently, that some of the recent funding calls, not the traditional ones, are not giving feedback. And as you say, it's not, it's an issue, and feedback, failure often isn't a learning experience if you don't get feedback. And I think there should be a commitment, particularly it can be hard for, to give feedback to every applicant for a job, but I think at least those who have given the time for interview, I think that is a responsibility on institutions and on funders to make sure they are giving feedback. As you say, I don't think it is a learning experience if you're not being given feedback on which you can learn from.
Yeah, I think especially when you're shortlisted for an interview, that means that they, from your CV at least, they saw something that fitted into the job description, let's say. And then when you don't get the job and they don't give you feedback, you don't really know what went wrong.
Exactly.
Well, I just want to say, though, that this came up earlier, I think, but sometimes you didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes it's just a lot of really good candidates and it's very hard to make a decision. So it's not always about wrongness. Sometimes it's other factors. Sometimes too, they're just intangibles that are involved that have nothing to do with you and your value, but other kinds of factors. So that's why I think it's always important to part of the learning process is taking good care of yourself, but also being positive about what you offer and what you can offer. Does anybody else want to comment on that?
I mean, I suppose I'd also say, sometimes you just cut your losses and move on, and accept that not everybody meets the good practice that we're describing, that's just part of life as well. I think getting too frustrated about that kind of behaviour can sometimes then impinge on your way forward and thinking about what your next step is. So, I mean, I'm not going to apologize for an external company, but I'd say that sometimes people just don't, you just got to kind of write it off as your own learning experience, and don't apply to that company again, and advise your friends not to either.
Yeah, I do agree with that. But, it's a very time-consuming process to apply and prepare for interviews. So not getting a feedback, it's just a gut punch sometimes. Even if they went with someone who's had better qualifications, that's enough for me. Let's say the candidate we chose had more publications than you, or he had more experience on X or Y. So that then I can, I'll know that, okay, if I want to pursue similar jobs, then I have to focus on X or Y.
But also, don't forget, as you said, it may well be a company policy. I mean, I've had tussles with HR before about whether or not I'm allowed to give written feedback to a candidate, and so I think there's, it may not be the actual interviewer that is taking that decision.
Yes, that's a good point. We're almost done here, but just quickly, the last question is about, overcoming a sense of rejecting yourself. And maybe Lauren, you've probably dealt with this more than anybody in your role. So do you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah. I think in some way, going back to the diagnostic element that I had potentially suggested as a really important starting point. You get rejected from, a graduate program, you get rejected from a fellowship, you get rejected by the person that you revealed your feelings for that you had a crush on for a long time. All of that feels different. It's a different type of failure. It depends a little bit on the context. But if there's a habitual way in which you can't diagnose or place what about the failure is disrupting or consequentially impacting how you're making decisions or applying for things, I think trying to, instead of just recognizing how that anxiety is producing itself and then what the consequences of that anxiety are, or resistance, or really self defeating behavior is, and then thinking about where does that exist within places where I might be able to try either a different reframing approach or a different application approach, or where is this even impacting what I do apply for, and why is that impacting what I apply for, put myself out there for, and then how, if the goal is to circumvent that loop, then what are strategies that allow a recontextualization of, and I mean, this is I guess doing cognitive behavioral therapy on yourself, because I mean, in some ways that's what this is. It's I want to be personal about failure. So then how do we step outside and say, what is motivating me? Why am I incentivized to act this way or not act this way? And then what might be an alternative to either how I think about the process or something that I'm doing in my behavior that I can change? And I think that's probably the place where you might get some traction. But certainly, coaching, I'm seeing Robert's thing here. Coaching services too are great. If you have resources in your programs or in your network, again, or your friends, colleagues here, also having a conversation and getting others' perspectives, even if that's practice interviewing. Well, none of you are probably on the selection committees, but doing some practice interviews at least allows you to perform your knowledge and think about how to do that in a number of different ways to develop a repertoire of presentation that then again you can start experimenting with. And a lot of this is a bit trial and error. But I do think if you're not trying and getting the feedback on the error, I think that's the most critical point that has the long-term negative impact, both in your satisfaction and your career prospects.
Yeah, which brings back that important point about your network and building relationships, because those are the resources that we often have that make a big difference when we're facing these situations. Right, we're now past time, but I think this was a great conversation, and I'm extremely grateful to the panelists for joining us from multiple countries, in fact, multiple time zones. So I'd like you all to just give a virtual round of applause to Naomi, Lauren, Elena, and Andrew. Thank you very much for joining us and providing your expertise and experiences. And thank you to all of you in the audience for your thoughts and questions.